Welcome, everyone. We're here today to tell you about the forest or farm to fork approach. And we're going to talk about the impacts of wild meats on food security, on biodiversity conservation, on livelihoods, but also on health. So we're going to work a little bit at that critical intersection, and we're going to basically give you an overview of how rights-based integrated approaches can inform safe and sustainable wild meat management. We're going to draw examples and lessons learned from across the world. We have a fantastic array of speakers that are going to tell you about this. We're going to discuss the current state of knowledge on the topic. We're going to highlight the gaps, the needs and the opportunities for future research and interventions across this region, but also more broadly. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome the first speaker, Jasmine. She's working at CIFOR-ICRAF, but also with the University of Oxford. And she's going to take you through her work on Asia-Pacific wild meat value chains and what the gaps in knowledge and data are. Welcome, Jasmine. I don't know if you want to use this one or that one. Yeah. Okay. Oh, cool. I like this.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. As Manon mentioned, my name's Jasmine. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Oxford, but I also work as a research consultant at CIFOR, the Centre for International Forestry Research. And I'm going to be speaking this morning about some work that I've been doing for the SWM Asia-Pacific project, identifying the trends and knowledge gaps in research on wild meat in Southeast Asia. So first of all, I know a lot of you in the room work on wild meat already, but just for anyone who's not already familiar with the term, wild meat is defined as terrestrial wild animals used for food in all parts of the world by the IUCN. It has immense socioeconomic value, and so it has to be managed sustainably to avoid both species population decline and livelihood insecurity for anyone who's dependent on wild meat as a natural resource. So as part of my work for the project, I've been looking at the following research questions. First of all, how has wild meat been researched in Southeast Asia to date? Which interventions to manage wild meat sustainably have been implemented? And where are the gaps in our knowledge around wild meat use? And to do this, we used a systematic map to try and answer these questions. For anyone not familiar with the method, systematic mapping is basically a form of literature review. You can use it to identify what research has already been done on a particular topic and where the knowledge gaps are. So it's perfect for the kind of questions we're asking. So we search various academic directories using different keywords and phrases related to wild meat in 4 different languages to identify publications that looked at wild meat use in Southeast Asia. Our searches generated over 3,000 results, which we managed to narrow down to about 300 that were actually relevant to our research questions. Most of these were in English, 264 of the 302, and most were peer-reviewed academic articles. And the figure here shows the publications by year, and you can see that there's a steady increase in the number of publications being published each year, particularly from 2019 onwards. So once we identified these relevant publications, we extracted data from them to help answer our research questions. This included things like the type of data that was collected, the data collection methods, the broad themes that the paper collected data on or discussed, the drivers of wild meat that were mentioned, and any information about interventions that aim to manage wild meat use sustainably. So far, this work is ongoing. So far we've reviewed 135 of these publications. And so I wanted to share some preliminary results based on this selection. We found that Indonesia had the highest number of publications so far, followed by Vietnam. Couple of countries, Brunei and Singapore, which is hard to see on there, but they only had 2 publications focused on them. And so far, Timor-Leste has had none. And then we also had 14 that looked at Southeast Asia as a region. So most studies used interviews as their method of data collection, and this kind of fell into 2 categories, either publications that interviewed participants to understand their knowledge or perceptions of a topic. And the second one where researchers would ask people about their wild meat use, like recalling what they hunted or ate. And this method was followed by direct observation. So for example, researchers visiting a market and recording the wild meat that was for sale there. So as I mentioned, we recorded the themes that the publications focused on, and we split the publications into two types. So those that use primary or secondary data to understand a particular theme, and review papers that discussed a theme. And then the values in the table indicate how many papers collected data on or mentioned a theme. So you can see that most of the data papers focused on understanding what's hunted and what's traded, while the review papers here on the right-hand side focus more on trade. And just from my understanding of the literature, this was often international and illegal trade. So other themes included things like governance, so laws and policies or law enforcement, actors in the supply chain, zoonotic disease, and then the impacts of wild meat use. And again, you can see the data papers, they were focused on things like understanding hunter and consumer attributes. So who's hunting wild meat, the demographics of that. While review papers focused more on laws and regulations. And again, they talked a lot about international trade. And in terms of the impacts of wild meat use, the category at the bottom, a lot of the data papers wanted to understand how wild meat use impacted species. So, for example, they might use ecological surveys to monitor species population trends to then understand the impact of hunting on species numbers. We also recorded the drivers that each publication collected data on or discussed. So unsurprisingly, you can see at the top, food was the most common driver that was mentioned in both paper types, followed by income and traditional medicine. And there are some other interesting drivers like tradition and religion. And we also started at the bottom here to look at the external drive, external drivers like maybe an economic downturn leading people to consume more wild meat, and the non-use drivers as well, which are interesting but a lot less frequently mentioned. And finally, we wanted to understand what work has been done in Southeast Asia to address the issue of unsustainable wild meat use. So we recorded whenever a publication mentioned an intervention that was aimed at managing wild meat more sustainably. We wanted to know the type of intervention that was mentioned and then the stage of the intervention that was talked about as well. This information was really scarce, though. Only 35 of the 135 publications that we've reviewed so far actually mentioned interventions. And these were mostly related, as you can see in the green, to law enforcement or policy. Some of the publications just described that an intervention existed. Others might look at a particular stage, like the design and implementation stage, or evaluated how effective that intervention was. But yeah, a lot, you can see in the orange there, just looked at, just gave recommendations, on what interventions could be implemented. So what does this all mean? So research on wild meat is steadily growing in Southeast Asia, mostly focused on understanding how wild meat is used. Research is mostly based on qualitative data, like interview responses, and these are really useful, but possibly might indicate perhaps an over-reliance on self-reported data. There's an uneven geographic coverage, which potentially might limit our understanding of wild meat in some areas, and possibly mean that regional conservation and policies are less effective. And then some papers tried to understand why wild meat is used, but there was less information on things like socio-cultural drivers or those wider external drivers. And this lack of information might mean that interventions to address unsustainable use may not be able to address all the motivations for wild meat use, particularly those that are rooted in identity and belief systems. And then finally, a few publications discuss wild meat interventions, and those that did tended to describe them rather than analysing them. And they they rarely evaluated their effectiveness. And this risks us not being able to kind of understand whether our conservation efforts are working or not. I'm pretty much out of time, but just quickly before I finish, I wanted to say thanks to all my colleagues at CIFOR, at FAO, and at WCS Vietnam for their help on this project. And I also wanted to mention my colleague Della, who was working with me on this, but sadly passed away earlier this year. She put a lot of time and effort into this project, and I wanted to recognise that today. And finally, as part of the SWM Asia Pacific project, we're conducting a regional analysis based on the data that's actually contained in these publications. So if you have data on wild meat in Southeast Asia, we'd like to speak to you. So either come and approach one of us after the session, or you can email us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was really fascinating. Thanks for sharing your work. Our second speaker today is Harshad. Harshad is also working for the SWM Programme, and he's going to tell you about the importance of hunting and consumption of wildlife in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Welcome.
Thanks, Mano. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about sustainable wildlife use in Papua New Guinea, where I work. So for those of you who don't know, Papua New Guinea is this country which is the eastern part of the New Guinea island. It's same size as Sweden or Japan, just to the north of Australia, so not very far from here. It's one of the most biodiverse and culturally diverse countries in the world. It has about more than 800 distinct languages, some incredible iconic fauna. So it's home to several iconic species such as tree kangaroos and birds of paradise. About 97% of the country's land is under customary tenure, and I'll get to why that is important in the conservation context. Like many developing countries, there's rapid growth and modernization of the populations, a loss of traditional practices and knowledge, and there's threat of extractive industries like logging and mining. Hunting for protein and bilas, which bilas means customary adornments, so you can see some of them in the picture. It's a very important part of most of these indigenous cultures in PNG. We wanted to understand hunting and wild meat consumption in the PNG highlands as a part of our conservation work. And we conducted a bunch of surveys, some hunter intercept surveys, some recollection surveys later in the village, a few dietary recall surveys, and then an indirect survey technique called the unmatched count technique. What we found was more or less on the lines of what we expected, at least with the hunter surveys. So the biggest categories that were hunted were macropods, which is basically the kangaroo family, tree kangaroos in the case of PNG, and then a bunch of birds, including birds of paradise, megapods, and cassowaries. So some of the commonly hunted species groups were from these families. This hunting is, of course, both for protein, so source of wild meat, and for the bilas, so the feathers and other things that are used in customary attire. One interesting thing, so the hunting surveys were followed by a dietary recall survey, but that turned up some disappointing yet interesting results. It showed that there was zero consumption of wild meat, and that was really fascinating because we knew that that's not true. So what we decided was to use an indirect survey technique called the unmatched count technique. And this, without getting into the sort of the weeds of this method, we found some really interesting results. So about a quarter of respondents in both of the communities where we did these surveys, these are communities in the PNG Highlands, they had consumed couscous, which is a kind of a possum, within a year of the survey. Yet another really important finding was that about a quarter of respondents had consumed bats. And this is fascinating because this is not commonly reported or understood in PNG. Most people, when you talk to them, don't really talk about bats as an important group that is consumed. And in today's world, we can understand the ramifications or implications it has in terms of One Health or zoonotic diseases. So some quick insights from this. Wild meat remains an important and likely underreported source of protein in indigenous community diets in PNG. While a few groups are, consumption of these few groups is well documented, some other groups like bats is not understood as well. So we need to have additional emphasis on alternative protein sources and livelihood security to ensure that the hunting levels are or remain sustainable. And then, of course, as I said, conservation efforts in PNG need to emphasize more on zoonotic disease monitoring and One Health issues, given the linkages with bat consumptions in PNG. And social scientists will probably go like, duh, but surveys that focus on behavioral data need to incorporate both direct and indirect survey techniques. It's something that we tend to forget at times. So how are we sort of addressing this issue or dealing with it and ensuring sustainability? So one of the powerful tools that is used in PNG and has been very successful is this concept called conservation deeds. So conservation deeds are private legal agreements based on contract law between individual indigenous landowners to conserve and manage individual and communal lands. These deeds are legally enforceable. There was a judgment in April 2025 where a top court in PNG ruled that the assigned conservation deed actually takes precedence over other agreements that were created by extractive industries. So it's actually helped in protecting these customary lands from extractive industries like mining or logging. And then, so under the SWM program, WCS PNG has facilitated the creation of 4 conservation deeds in the PNG Highlands. The last of these was just signed 2 weeks ago. So this is a very powerful ground-up, bottom-up sort of conservation tool to help indigenous communities to protect and sustainably manage their lands. So, sorry, there's a lot going on in this slide. It's just a quick map to show the 4 sites where these deeds have been signed. So it's 4 CD signed, 24 different tribal clans across 3 provinces are a part of these deeds, covering over 8,000 people. And it includes about 200, or more than 200 square kilometers of land, out of which about 50% is under a total hunting ban, and this 50% is primary high integrity rainforest. So there's a lot of value in doing this. There's not too many formally conserved areas like a protected area in a Western sense in PNG. So these deeds are really important. And part of this model is of course working on everything that is important to the community. So working on livelihoods, working on commodities like coffee, working with the communities to create nurseries to help them reforest some of their degraded lands, etc. So it's an integral part of this model that we are working on. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I forgot to mention that we'll take all questions towards the end, but if you do need to leave before that, we'll be hanging out after the session, and we also have a booth downstairs, so feel free to come and talk to us and chat a bit more about this. Our next speaker is Dr. Ekta Patel. She's from the International Livestock Research Institute, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about the zoonotic disease aspect and how we can better manage wild meat value chains, drawing from examples across Asia and Africa. Welcome. Oops, sorry.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Let me start by saying thank you for all being here. It's taken me 33 hours to be here for 5 days, so I'm going to try and do as much as possible to share things about what our organization does. So I'm really excited to talk to you about mitigating zoonotic disease risks. My work specifically is at the Kenya-Tanzania border, so if anyone's been there, you can wave your hands here. Masai Mara, great to see people there. I also want to take the opportunity to share with you some of my colleagues' work from Nigeria as well as Kenya urban settings. And then we've got teams in Vietnam. So the International Livestock Research Institute is the only CGIAR institute that works on livestock. And so we're headquartered in Kenya and Ethiopia with a total of 14 offices across Africa and Asia. And we work mainly through sort of our national partners to support women, youth and smallholders to have sort of sustainable systems and build our capacity in this space. ILRI's been working on One Health for forever, actually. And one of the vision is to sort of improve livelihoods and well-being of people in the global south by building healthy and resilient systems. And our One Health strategy has been looking at sort of three main parts, which is addressing epidemics, pandemics, endemic zoonosis, foodborne diseases, antimicrobial resistance. And we work on One Health using sort of three interconnected pillars, which are sort of technical, institutional, and policy. And I don't have the opportunity to share with you everything that our organization does, but the division itself has several of these areas, so we lean into one another to get this done. ILRI's entry point into One Health is through the livestock interface, and I specifically work at the wildlife livestock interface. So we're operating in sub-Saharan Africa, where livestock and wildlife are co-grazing, so we've seen sort of disease spill over in these spaces, so we thought it's a good opportunity to start addressing some of these challenges. And mainly our teams work on zoonotic diseases, food safety, and AMR. And the aim of sort of working in sustainable livestock management with wildlife conservation is to enhance biodiversity and then improve environmental resilience. So I just want to quickly share with you, as of 3 weeks ago, we've become World Animal Health's first collaborating center for One Health. And so we are seeing a lot more pressure and momentum to make sure that we get a lot of work done underway. Now we can talk about the fun stuff. So there's been a lot of global challenges about wild meat trade. And while everybody else is talking about sort of conservation, biodiversity, we're very keen to address disease risks, mainly because we're noticing a lot of communities infected with sort of anthrax or in their skin and in their pores. So one of the things that we noticed is that, there's challenges with sort of public awareness. There's also regulation challenges that we're seeing. For example, Tanzania recently allowed wild meat trade, wherein Kenya is trying to do the same thing, but there's not a very good proper regulatory mechanism. So in East Africa, wild meat is widespread, and there's very many drivers. But one of the things I want to share with you is this is sort of an infographic we put together to show how complex the system looks like. And there seems to be very many actors across the value chain. The demand continues to increase due to increasing population. There is lack of alternative proteins, but it's also very economically viable. People are making money out of it, or at least the small communities are. But we need to continue to address this if we're going the sustainable way. My project specifically was to focus on disease risk perceptions, and the aim here was to generate evidence that's going to contribute to understanding the drivers. What are some of the spillovers? So what does spread of pathogens look like? And I won't go into those details, but just to share with you that we've been working with CIFOR, our national organizations, as well as traffic. As mentioned, we work at the Kenya-Tanzania border. From Tanzania, we're sort of at the Kilimanjaro sides, and the Masai Mara interviewed community members using free, prior, and informed consent forms. And we're very keen to understand a little bit more about sort of what the gender roles are, as well as where do the youth participate in all of this. Again, I won't go through a lot of the results, and I think some of you are sitting and you've received flyers there, so you should be able to get some of our results there. But one of the things we found is that 79% of our respondents believe that it was risky to consume some wild meat, but they continue to do this. They're very aware of zoonotic diseases like anthrax, Ebola, as well as brucellosis. And interestingly, when comparing studies with what Traffic has done, there are similar patterns in terms of what species are being consumed, including birds and rodents. So some of the things we concluded was that one of the big things we want to do is address why our communities have, practicing risky behaviors, and are we able to generate interventions on behavioral change mechanisms. So those are some of the things that we're going to try and get into. The team in Nigeria has been looking at sort of urban settings and what's going on in urban Kenya as well as Nigeria. And they're also noticing that some of the high taxa consumptions are sort of monkeys, rodents, and pangolins. There's a gendered pattern where men are sort of hunting, whereas women are trading. And then there's risks of cross-border protection, cross-border disease transmission. And a lot of their work right now is looking at the scientific analysis of it. In Vietnam, the team went to wildlife farms, and they went into Lao Cai as well as Dong Nai provinces to assess the prevalence of zoonotic diseases there. They're working with national partners. Samples have been collected from animals, fecal samples as well as oral swabs, and then human samples. From Vietnam, we've noticed that there is serological evidence to show that there's human exposure to hantavirus, hepatitis E. And mainly these, I think the takeaway here for me is that mainly these findings were from the farmers themselves who are managing these wildlife farms. So a big thing for us, and we're really excited about this because we have, our PS of Livestock. We have a lot of close connections to our ministries. So we're starting to drive this narrative upward for policy change and to understand that there's cultural changes, gendered exposures, and there is a low awareness of wild meat-borne illnesses, and we want to try and raise this up with our ministries. So Harshad tells me I have 1 minute left. So very quickly, I just want to share with you that one of the things that we want to do right now, and you might see some of these cards, there's some up here, or like Manon said, come and have a chat with us. We launched sort of a report on eating wild meat and what are some of the rewards and risks on it. But we're keen to develop a gendered framework for wild meat. And I don't know how many of you know this, but if a woman in Uganda is caught with a kilo of zebra meat, for example, she's it's life imprisonment for her. So you're removing one woman for a kilo of meat that has showed up at her doorstep. She's trying to make a livelihood, and it disrupts an entire family. So we're very keen to expand on some of this work. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ekta. That's certainly something that doesn't get talked a lot about, the huge equity implications of wild meat trade and consumption. The next speaker will take us across to Indonesian Borneo. That is Katie Spencer. She's from the University of Kent, the DICE Center. Sorry, I forgot the acronym. But Katie, please, very welcome to have you here. Looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. As Manon said, I'm Katie Spencer. I'm a postdoc at the University of Kent, and today I'll be talking about some of our research on wild meat consumption in changing rural landscapes of Indonesian Borneo. And I thought by now you might have a good idea about wild meat, so I'll jump straight into more of the context for Indonesia. So Indonesia is a hugely diverse and rich country, not just in wildlife, but also in terms of people and culture. So Indonesia is actually over 17,000 different islands, and with that there's over 1,000 different ethnicities, around 700 local languages. Some people live in really big cities, other people live in really remote villages. So the way people interact with food and their food choices are hugely variable, and especially when we start to think about food from the forest and wild meat consumption. But this makes it challenging, of course, when we start to think about how do we sustainably feed a growing population whilst also protecting the environment. And to achieve this, we will need more localized research to inform evidence-based recommendations for sustainable wild meat. And as mentioned, there are some studies in Indonesia, but they're quite disproportionately focused in places like northern Sulawesi. And there's not a lot of research in Indonesian Borneo, which is where I do most of my research. So to address this gap, we worked with a local organisation, YTS, who collected all of the data on our behalf, and they visited 2 landscapes which are geographically close but quite distinct. So they visited 28 villages and around over 600 households. In these both landscapes, most people were Dayak, which is kind of the broad term for the indigenous groups of Borneo, but their livelihoods and the landscapes they live in are changing quite fast. So more and more people are starting to work in palm oil, for example, or gold mining, and their forests are being changed every year. So what I'm presenting today is just kind of a small subset of our research, and this is still ongoing. So we're actually scaling this up to East and West Kalimantan now. So what I'm presenting today is just from Central Kalimantan. And the project is looking into how people are interacting with forests and how this influences their livelihoods and what species they're interacting with and so on. One thing our lab group is interested in as a whole is multidimensional well-being, and you might have heard this come up in other talks through the conference. And we were interested in whether this was a driver of wild meat consumption instead of, for example, just income or wealth, because well-being looks at all the different assets, resources, and attributes that somebody might need to achieve a better life. So the Indonesian government actually conduct a huge census around every 4 years or so. They visit every single village, ask a huge questionnaire, and this questionnaire has already been developed into a multidimensional wellbeing index, which has been used quite successfully, looking at the impacts of mining, protected areas, and palm oil. So we actually needed to look at wellbeing at a household level. So we redesigned some of these questions that could be asked at the household level. So on to the results. So the darker areas are more frequent consumption. And straight away we could see that freshwater fish was actually the most important protein source for people in both of our landscapes. So around 99% of people were eating freshwater fish on a daily basis because they live alongside large rivers. We could also see patterns coming out between Rungun and Sabangau, so probably due to religious differences. So most people we interviewed in Rungun were Christian, most people in Sabangau were Muslim, and this was coming through in their food choices, in domestic meats that they were eating. And when we look at wild meat more kind of broadly, about 78% of people in Rungun had consumed wild meat in the last 12 months, and this is about twice as many people as in Sabangau. But what also jumped out was that the frequency of wild meat consumption was much lower than we would expect. So being Dayak communities, they do have quite strong historical and cultural ties with forest and hunting and eating wild meat. So I kind of expected this would be higher than less than every 6 months, and we'll get on to why this might be in a moment. But we were also interested in what people were eating and how this might have changed over time. So we asked people, what have you consumed in the last 12 months and what did you used to eat but is no longer available to you? So in Rungun, people were eating a higher number and diversity of species, so that, about 24 different species, and half of these were on the protected species list. But we could also see people were eating different species. So in Rungun, more people were eating bearded pig, and very few people were eating this in Sabangau because it's haram. But also, interestingly, a lot of people said that bearded pig was no longer available to them. And we know this is probably because of African swine fever, which has absolutely decimated populations of pigs across Southeast Asia. So that was coming through in the patterns of what people had consumed in the last year. But we could also see that people used to eat critically endangered species like proboscis monkey and pangolin, but they were saying they weren't able to find them anymore. And not presented here, but most people were consuming different species simply because it tastes good. There's a few species like sun bear, bats, and snake, which were consumed for medicinal reasons, but they weren't consumed very often or by many people. So we also wanted to understand what is driving more frequent wild meat consumption. So we looked at a wide range of different variables in an ordinal logistic regression model. But the top model included which landscape the respondent was from, whether they'd hunted in the last 12 months, and also our multidimensional wellbeing index, which is really exciting that it actually worked. So people in Rungun were consuming meat more frequently. There was a much higher odds of consuming meat if you'd hunted, which makes sense. But actually, our wellbeing index provided at first maybe the opposite to what we'd expect. So in a lot of literature, you tend to find that it's reported that people in rural landscapes are consuming wild meat out of poverty or because they don't have access to other different types of wild meat. And that doesn't seem to be the case in our landscape. So it was actually those with higher levels of wellbeing were able to consume wild meat more frequently. So perhaps they have the resources or money available to do so. And why might this be? Well, we did ask people why they weren't able to consume wild meat more frequently, and the top two reasons were access and cost. So it's becoming more difficult to find, and it is costing too much. And why might this be? We also asked people kind of a broad question about what they thought was happening to wildlife in the forests surrounding their villages. And this is a really insightful question. We got a really wide range of answers about different animals. But a lot of people were saying there's agricultural expansion, there's mining, there's disease in the pigs, there's changing weather patterns, and all of this is influencing the species around our forests. But what also came out in this, which we didn't go into the study even considering really, was freshwater fish. A lot of people were saying they were also in decline because of river pollution, because of like murkiness in the rivers, and also changing weather patterns and climate change. So this is quite concerning. If we go back to a few slides ago, around 99% of people were eating freshwater fish on a daily basis. So perhaps this is actually more of an issue for food security of people in these landscapes and is a bit overlooked at the moment. So I had to go through that really quickly, but the overall kind of findings here is that there is a low frequency of consumption in these landscapes, but there's changing species level patterns of what people are eating, and stories from community members are indicating that there is a declining availability of wild meat and wild animals. But it's not just hunting that we need to look at. There's so many multiple stresses happening in the wider environment that are all influencing how resilient animal populations are to hunting, which in turn affects how sustainable it might be. And it's really complicated, but we need to take all of this into account. And I didn't really have time to go through this, but taste is a primary driver of wild meat consumption, and there's lots of other things at play there, like religion and traditional beliefs. And I guess the take home is that wild meat may not be essential for food security in these landscapes because they have access to freshwater fish. But if freshwater fish start to decline, that perhaps is more of a problem for their livelihoods and their food security. So yeah, I just wanted to say I'm presenting this research, but this really wouldn't have been possible without a huge team of people in the UK and Indonesia. And I want to thank those and all the people who spent time answering our questionnaire. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was really interesting. Last but not the least, we'll have Mano from FAO.
Thank you, Arshad. Yeah, it was a little bit weird to introduce myself, but hello everyone again. My name is Manon, and yeah, as Arshad said, I work for FAO, but really I work together with this fantastic partnership of organization and many more that can't fit on the slide, especially national research organizations and community-based organizations and governments that we work with. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Sustainable Wildlife Management Programme, SWM for short. It's an international initiative. We've been working since 2017 to broadly reconcile wildlife conservation with rural food security, livelihoods, and reduce health risks through community-based approaches and using One Health lens. Yeah, the clicker is here. All right. So we work in various tropical landscapes in about 16 countries. We're adding some more currently. During the first phase of the program, we were mostly centered in Africa. Okay, that doesn't work. But recently we've started to scale up our work in Asia and the Pacific. And in all of these countries, we encounter vastly different contexts: social, economic, cultural, ecological, all different challenges and contexts. So each of the models that we use that are shown here, they're adapted to the local realities and the priorities that are defined together with the communities that we work with. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about the sites where we work and where we work there together with communities and local authorities and national authorities as well to better manage wild meat value chains and local hunting systems. So this is a somewhat simplified value chains. Ekta showed you a very complex ones, and they are very complex, but this should give you an overview of the fairly typical wild meat value chains that we encounter in some of our sites. So you start from the farm or the forest, you've got some local consumption going, and then you've got some transport to the market, vendors, restaurants, and then to peri-urban and urban areas. And sometimes that also flows into international trade systems. Whether it's legal or illegal is a different question. And while some wild meat value chains can be extremely well managed and they can be sustainable, that it is possible, or very often this is not the case. And we can encounter several issues. So first, hunting and farming is often poorly regulated, and depending on the local and outside demand for meat, this can quickly become unsustainable. And it can quickly lead to a situation of overhunting and a loss of wildlife populations. When communities hunt for subsistence purposes and have few other options, this quickly leads to devastating impacts on food security and livelihoods. And on top of that, wild meat value chains are mostly informal. That means poor transport, butchering, handling conditions. The frequency of interactions with wildlife in the wild meat value chain carries huge risks for the emergence, the transmission, and the amplification of potentially dangerous zoonotic pathogens, particularly when species are being caught and transported live and together with other species. And sometimes we have situations when the hunting and trading of wildlife and other wildlife products is illegal, but most countries do not have the necessary systems in place to deal with this. Blanket bans on wildlife are very often ineffective. They can drive the trade further underground, and that makes it very difficult to deal with. And that also can threaten further the food security and the well-being of people who do depend on this. So, what do we do about this? In the SWM program, we try and first understand what's going on. We start with a detailed mapping of the wild meat value chains, its actors, the species, volume of meat that they hunt, farms, the consumption, the trade, when and where they do it, what their motivations are, and the practices that they use. Once we have this information, we try and understand the impacts of wild meat trade and consumption on socio-ecological systems. So we need to carry out biodiversity assessments, conduct risk assessments, in particular at priority nodes in the value chain. And we need to understand wild meat consumption patterns, how much it contributes to local food security and livelihoods in the source communities, but also understand consumption at peri-urban and urban levels. So I'm going to give you some practical examples of what we did in some of our sites. On the left-hand side here, this is Gabon. We work with hunting communities towards the strengthening of the sustainability and the safety of legal value chains for wild meat. So we've got a pretty good mapping already of the value chains that are concerned, and we've done risk assessments along these value chains, looking for key pathogens like Ebola virus, amoebas, but also anthrax. And here you've got a very simplified diagram that was extracted from a meeting with community-based organizations that shows basically the hotspots within that value chain where we found these diseases. And we've got several examples in Guyana along wild bird trade chains, but I don't have time to go into it. All right. Now that we understand the situation and the risks a little better, we can try and figure out what to do. So, standing on the shoulder of many, many others and doing a bit of trial and error, we find that to effectively manage wild meat value chains, we need to adopt a value chain approach, forest to fork or farm to fork. So we need integrated interventions both upstream and downstream, as well as working on the broader enabling environment. The enabling environment, you have to use community rights-based approaches and to promote community-based governance systems. We conduct FPIC and co-design intervention based on locally identified conservation priorities. We support coordination of One Health efforts both at provincial and national level. We assess the One Health systems, the capacities of government and agencies, particularly wild animal health. We look at gap analyses to identify weaknesses and opportunities in those systems. And we also support One Health coordination system platforms, So this is an example from the one that was set up in Guyana, for instance. And we also we work on sectoral policies and legislations. We conduct comprehensive legal analyses to identify gaps, inconsistencies, and institutional weaknesses. And then we work with government towards policy reform and enforcement. Upstream approaches, A lot of that is sustainable wildlife management, again, done through community rights-based approaches. That is way too broad to summarize in the minute that I have left, but it goes from anything like promoting sustainable hunting or conservation practices where hunting is unsustainable, to empowering communities to devise their own rules on wildlife use based on customary law or traditional knowledge, supporting nature-friendly enterprises, etc., and working mostly with communities towards participatory surveillance. I'm going to be over time, that's okay. We have some time left. Downstream approaches, so we can focus on how to improve food safety and biosecurity in the wild meat value chain. That includes working on services and standards with operators, whether that's informal or formal, training on safer hygiene and food safety practices, facilitating access to equipment, transport, PPE, storage infrastructure, but also promoting value chain organizations that facilitate this control. And we do also work a little bit on awareness and behavior change, noting that that is sometimes appropriate, but we do need to work on all of these other integrated issues. And behavior change is mostly effective, we find in our sites, particularly with peri-urban and urban communities, when you have communities that are, like Katie was describing, that have already quite a high level of wealth and where you can influence those choices. You cannot expect to go to a community that depends on wild meat for their sustenance, their livelihoods, and their food security and tell them, no, you need to eat something else. So we have a few examples of the things that we do, and this is, for instance, a smart game that was developed by colleagues in Guyana. So in summary, sorry I'll run a little bit over time, diagnostic assessments are very crucial in understanding the situation at the site level. We need to look at it through an integrated lens. You need to build trust with value chain actors, starting with communities, together with authorities at provincial and national level, but also all of the other actors in your value chain. You have to go beyond just participatory approaches. The co-design of interventions is really crucial. That's what we've been finding from the past 10 years of implementation. Connecting that bottom-up and top-down approaches, working in concert with community-based organizations and governments is really important. And you have to be flexible and understand that change takes time. Very broadly, this is an example from our sites in Gabon. So starting work in 2018, and this was the beginning of last year. It takes a long time to implement things. You run across a lot of challenges that you didn't expect along the way, and that needs to be communicated to governments, to donors, and across to communities as well, importantly, that change takes time. And we've got a lot of publications, a lot of upcoming publications. You can come and talk to us at our booth, or we'll hang around there for the next 10, 12 minutes, but we'll also be there the rest of today. Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite the other speakers that were here today to come up to the stage with me. And if you have any questions or comments or discussion points, this is really, there's an idea to basically have a little bit of a discussion with you and understand how we can build on this work and do better. Any questions?
Thank you for a great series of presentations. My question is mainly for Harshad, but others could comment. It's about this measurement challenge, right? I was curious, do you have any idea why there was a social desirability bias in the consumption, but not in the hunting of wild meat? Why people were more free to respond to that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I honestly don't have an answer for that. I think there's a lot that goes on in these surveys. It depends on the relationship between the surveyor and the respondents. The hunters sometimes tend to be a little more open to talking about their behavior because sort of the WCS staff and the community, everybody knows the hunters. They know they go out to hunt. But consumption is slightly different in terms of wild meat. And I think what we suspect, I mean, this is very much a hypothesis. We have no evidence to say that this is the case, but we suspect that because our organization is the Wildlife Conservation Society, I think the community tells us what they think we want to hear when we ask about wild meat consumption. And that's the reason why there's such a stark difference between the direct survey approaches and the indirect survey approaches.
Arshad, you know WCS PNG did very detailed consumption studies 20 years ago, down to species and where they were hunted and things. Have you considered repeating those studies? Because there were explicit predictions of what was unsustainable and what wasn't. So if you just do the same thing over again, you would get a really good answer on what the trajectories are.
So we did these surveys. The dietary recall surveys that we did were about 2 or 3 years ago, and that's where we got the data, which did not show anything. I'll look into the report that you're talking about and pull that out from our records and see what that says.
Yeah, it showed about 25 grams of consumption per person per day of wild meat. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you. Any other questions? I saw some hands. I'm going to work my way to the back.
Hello, my question is to Katie. So I think it's very interesting to see that actually people reported consuming the wild boar, for 80% in the last 12 months. But they also reported that the occurrence of they are seeing wild boar is actually declining. Can you speak a little bit about that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. That's something that we saw straight away as well. So I think it's probably due to the fact that the length of time. So somebody might have said they reported, yes, they had eaten it, but maybe it was 11 months ago. And then they're saying that also means they used to eat it, but it's no longer available to them because they might not have been able to get it more recently, or perhaps it's much harder to get than it used to be. So they're reporting kind of both. I think that's what's come into there. It's kind of the time frame of the questions. Yeah.
I have kind of 2 questions also for Katie and also for you, Manon. Katie, that was a really fascinating presentation and amazing how much kind of rich data you've got there. I thought there was a couple of interesting things. I'd love to talk to you actually about that well-being data as well, but I can talk to you about that after. I was wondering, one, whether it was interesting that there were some protected species that people mentioned, and typically they were like, oh, in the past. And I wondered whether there might be any social desirability bias in that data, and maybe they're willing to say, we used to consume it before, but they're not willing to admit that they do it now. And if you just ask direct questions. And then another question, and you kind of touched on it in the end, is whether you'd looked at perhaps looking at the interactions between declining fish stocks and increasing consumption of other types of wild meat. Because I think there's been some interesting studies in the past. I think it was in like West Africa, where like marine fish stocks declining actually caused an increase in bushmeat consumption, and whether there's some interesting patterns there.
Yeah, so firstly, I think that's a really good point. That could have been the case, but we have been working in the landscapes now. If you were at her talk earlier in the week, she's been working there for a very long time and has quite open discussions with people. And we've been doing camera trapping there recently as well. And proboscis monkey, they used to be along the riverbank. It used to be really easy to find, and they're just not there anymore. So I think, for example, that they are just not there, and that's why people can't eat them anymore. And there was a study done about 10 years ago by Susan Chain, who went to some of these villages, and people were reporting that they were eating proboscis monkey and pangolins. So perhaps it is that they're just not there. They're really hard to find, and we have camera trap data to kind of back that up as well. And then second point, I didn't go into the study even thinking about freshwater fish, which is kind of annoying now with hindsight, because it did come out as quite an important topic. But I do think that it maybe is a bit of a ticking time bomb with the waterways and other researchers, if that's something you're interested in, even like water quality, fish catch. That is definitely something that needs to be looked at, but it wasn't a primary aim, and it's only come out through this kind of open-ended question, which I'm really glad we asked, because otherwise maybe we wouldn't have known about that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then Manon, if I can just ask, I was wondering, so it looks like you've got a huge portfolio of loads of interventions, which look amazing. And I wondered whether you had thought about doing any, like what your kind of impact evaluation approach is. And if you'd ever done, I'm only saying this because it's what I'm interested in, like any experimental impact evaluations, or how are you looking at I guess, evaluating the outcomes from the programs?
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. We'll always need to wonder whether what we're doing is actually successful, or whether we're just, just talking. So we do have an impact evaluation ongoing. The results from it aren't fully published. We did have a midterm evaluation that was done looking at both how it worked, the progress and the impact indicators. We have a fairly extensive monitoring evaluation system. And it's very challenging to do that on so many sites because a lot of the detail and the context-specific impacts get a little bit lost once you escalate things to global level. So we will have a public platform where we'll show some of the indicators and how both social, ecological, and economic that sort of show at site level what we're looking at, but also at national and global level, the kind of things that we've managed to do. It's not yet published. However, if you go to our website, you will see the executive summary from the first phase, which ended in 2023, and that has some statistics and some things there for you. But it is, although we've been running for a long time and it's a fairly big project, it's also, this morning we were talking about, the short project cycling and the short donor cycling. And in many countries, we're seeing we're not yet there. The sustainability is not there. In an ideal world, we would want to have an exit. Well, we want to have an exit strategy. We want to be able to leave the community-based organization thinking, okay, they're able to deal with it. They're able to they have their management plans. They know what to do. They don't need us anymore. And that would be the dream. But after almost 10 years of implementation in most countries, we're still not there yet. Particularly because in many countries, the legal and the institutional system is also not supportive of customary use and land tenure, and that is a huge issue that many of you know about. Oh my God, okay. All right. Yes, Madam.
Thank you. My question is to Jasmine. I was just wondering how your literature review, that's very comprehensive. How does that inform practice on the ground? Was there any particular target you were targeting? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. I think this work is, mostly to kind of find out what research has been done already and where the knowledge gaps are. I think that's the most important thing that will hopefully come out of this. It is still ongoing, so we're not at that point yet. I mentioned some of the, initial thoughts we had based on the publications, but we've only been through about half of them. But anyway, I think it's about working out where the knowledge gaps are, and then I have colleagues within FAO and CIFOR working on the SWM project who are going to kind of hopefully plug those knowledge gaps. That's the idea, yeah.
There's a question there. Would you be able to pass the mic? I'm sorry.
Thank you. Great array of presentations today, and I love the breadth of topics that were covered. I had one comment and one question. That's all right. So the presentations on zoonotic risks was really, really interesting and great to see that work happening, and a huge amount of guidance that was provided in all of your presentations today. I just wanted to flag two other key documents that I thought were worthwhile flagging to the audience. The first one was the World Organization for Animal Health has developed some guidelines on disease risks or addressing disease risks in wildlife trade, and that was a collaborative effort with FAO and CITES and Traffic and many, many key players. So if you're not aware of that already, it's really useful sort of high-level guidance to get you started if you haven't looked at disease risks. And that leads me to my question, which is a lot of what we talk about when we talk about wildlife supply chains is zoonotic risks, but there are other disease risks, for example, disease risks to wildlife themselves. And I was actually wondering from Jasmine, with your literature review, you had health risks as one of the elements that you were looking at, and I was wondering if that was predominantly human health risks or it was actually health risks to other species or other animals, not just humans.
Yeah, that is such a good question, and Yeah, at the moment we've just included human health. So yeah, I had a whole category that was like, well, it appears twice. I have a whole section on zoonotic disease risk, and yeah, whether a paper collected data on it, like looking at risk factors or perceptions, you know, whether like a vendor believes they might contract a zoonotic disease because they're handling wild meat. And then I had another couple of points in the impact section. Does the paper kind of look at, whether wild meat use is increasing the risk of transmission or emergence in the first place. But yeah, I didn't think of it from that angle. So in the process of deciding on that list of themes, we sort of populate it based on our knowledge within the team of wild meat. And then as I'm going through the literature, if anything emerges that I've not already captured in my list of themes, I'm adding it. But I don't think it's come up yet. I mean, we are still working through, so that's really helpful actually, because now I can bear that in mind. But so far that hasn't come up, yeah.